SMS Lutzow was the second of three Derflinger-class battlecruisers built for the Kaiserliche Marine. Laid down at the Schiehau yards in Danzig, more commonly known for building much of Germany's destroyer fleet at the time. The keel was laid down in May 1912, the hull launched at the end of November 1913, but commissioning was much delayed by the outbreak of war, and so the ship only went on trials in summer 1915, and only actually entered service with the fleet in March 1916, in the end for an operational career lasting less than 3 months. Compared to her predecessor, as was common with many German ships, there were a few incremental improvements despite ostensibly being of the same class. Lutzow was almost a knot faster in her trial runs, clocking in at just under 26.5 knots. She had space for another 200 tons of coal, and she had an extra watertight compartment for a total of 17. In addition, minor tweaks made her more stable so she could carry the full intended secondary battery of 14 single casement-mounted 5.9-inch guns. A Derflinger had to ditch 2 in order to fit anti-roll tanks, and her 4 anti-aircraft guns were positioned around the aft funnel as opposed to around the fore-funnel. A final weapons change was the use of larger 600mm torpedoes over the 500mm weapons on Derflinger. As was traditional for the German Navy at the time, she was ordered to ostensibly replace an older ship, in this case the 6,000-ton protected cruiser Kaiserin Augusta, although, as with many late 1900s and 1910s German warships, both ships would remain in service when the newer ship was launched, and in this case, Kaiserin Augusta would actually outlast her supposed successor by about 4 years. A month after commissioning and after a couple of quick sweeps in the North Sea, Lutzow would sail as part of the first scouting group, with Seydlitz serving as flagship, a duty that would soon be passed to Lutzow herself once Seydlitz hit a mine and had to head back home. This mission would see the bombardment of Yarmouth and Lowestoft, as well as a brief encounter with the Harwich force before everyone, including the supporting High Seas Fleet, headed home upon the news that the Grand Fleet had sailed in response. At the end of May 1916, now formally the flagship of 1st Scouting Group under the leadership of Admiral Hipper, Lutzow sailed out on a new mission, one that would lead to the Battle of Jutland. The start of this fight went well for Lutzow. She won the duel of the battlecruiser flagships, hitting HMS Line repeatedly and knocking out that ship's Q turret, in exchange for receiving a couple of hits high on the forecastle that didn't really impair her fighting ability at the time, whilst Lion was forced out of the battle line temporarily. As the battle swung around and head back north again, she'd take further hits from British battlecruisers and managed to evade a couple of torpedoes before being hit by 15-inch shells from the incoming 5th Battle Squadron. She returned fire, hitting Barham and Lion again, but at this point, whilst there were some minor fires and a small amount of flooding along with a few casualties, the ship was generally in good fighting trim, assisted by the fact that fuses on the British shelves were often causing them to burst on impact. The main effect of this bombardment was the destruction of the ship's wireless transmitters, which meant that Hipper was down to signal flags and signal lights only for the rest of the engagement. As the two fleets closed in on each other, unknowingly for the Germans, Lutzow would see off an attack by British destroyers and join in the barrage that sent the armoured cruiser HMS Defence to the bottom in the third massive magazine explosion of the day. Now, however, things started to take a slightly more serious turn as Admiral Hood's 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron arrived on the scene. Although the oldest battlecruisers present, they were fresh from Scapa Flow gunnery training, and in the space of a few minutes, 8 hits, almost all of which usually credited to HMS Invincible, tore up the bow of Lutzow and, more crucially, ripped open the bow torpedo room and breached the broadside torpedo room, although it was the forward room that was the most serious. Water rushed in at great pressure against the bulkheads due to the ship's speed, which would soon have to drop. Lutzow did get her revenge, though, as her return fire detonated Invincible, but the damage she'd taken was the start of a slow death. With such a large compartment flooded forward, the ship's bow began to dip. Already most of the forward compartments below the armour deck were flooded, but now both the other hits from the most recent engagement and those it suffered before began to take effect as water poured into the shell holes that had formerly been relatively clear of the sea. As the flooding was now spreading above the armour deck as well, the bow dipped ever deeper. Hipper had to be persuaded to allow himself to be taken off by a destroyer, and Lutzow attempted to withdraw under a smokescreen. But before it could fully form, British battleships scored 4 additional hits, knocking out one of the guns and jamming the foremost turret, crippling the super-firing forward turret and temporarily disabling the rearmost turret. Forced to keep up the best speed she could in order to get out of the range of British guns, flooding continued to spread, and by 9:30 that evening her forward decks were awash. Speed kept on dropping, and the water kept on rising. Less than an hour later, the forwardmost guns were submerged, and shortly after midnight the forward pumps failed, and speed dropped to a crawl. The ship was barely making 3 knots, lest the bulkheads rupture and the ship plunged to the seabed within minutes. Even so, flooding would continue to spread as the forward casemates now dipped into the sea and some of the boiler rooms had to be abandoned. Shortly after 1 o'clock that morning, the rudder and screws began to rise out of the water, and the only hope of moving her now was the escorting torpedo boats using tow ropes. But the combined 35,000 tons plus of ship and water was too much, and so the order to abandon ship was given. The ship was going down anyway, but SMS G-36 fired a couple of torpedoes to speed Lutzow on its way. The first one missed as it headed under the stern without impacting the aft end of the ship, due to the fact the aft was now practically out of the water. But the second torpedo hit amidships just as the rumble of failing internal bulkheads was heard, and shortly thereafter the ship rolled over to starboard and slipped beneath the waves.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.